Hello again, my friends, my students. Thanks for joining me for another lecture on egalitarianism and equality. And in this instance, the relationship between egalitarianism and another big ism, utilitarianism. So some key questions. What's the relationship between utilitarianism and egalitarianism? And what changes if we think of equality and utility in a dynamic perspective rather than a static one? Key words from this lecture include utilitarianism and, most importantly, the idea of diminishing marginal utility. Okay, so for those of you who've been asleep in this course, or perhaps for those of you who are just picking up this video somewhere on the internet, what is utilitarianism? Utilitarianism, briefly, is the view that the most moral thing you can do is maximize the total satisfaction of society. And satisfaction here is understood as subjective pleasure, what individuals themselves value or are satisfied by, whatever that is. Historically, utilitarianism and a certain kind of egalitarianism, understood as the desire to narrow the differences in material conditions, have tended to go together. Why is that? Well, the answer is encapsulated in the assumption that a dollar is worth more, that is to say, has more utility, to a poor person than a rich person. For the standard utilitarian, then, one can increase the total satisfaction of society by transferring dollars from rich people to poor people, since the poor people get more satisfaction from that dollar than the rich person, at least on average. The idea that a dollar is worth more to a poor person than to a rich person has a name, a fancy name called diminishing marginal utility. The word marginal here simply refers to the process of looking at what happens at the margin, that is to say, with every extra dollar. So the richer you get, the less valuable to you that extra dollar, every extra dollar is going to be, right? Making your first dollar is really important. Making your first $50,000 is important. Making your first $100,000 might be important. But beyond that, at some point, each extra dollar gives you relatively less satisfaction, at least according to this theory. This is a theory borrowed, by the way, straight from economics. Although many people see diminishing marginal utility as sort of cementing this marriage between utilitarianism and egalitarianism, the idea that more equality, more socioeconomic inequality equals more societal satisfaction, matters are not always quite that simple. In fact, many people have pushed back against this apparent union. So what are some problems with this marriage? Well, some people have challenged the idea of diminishing marginal utility itself, right? First of all, just because you're rich doesn't mean you're easy to satisfy. And just because you're poor doesn't mean you're not happy, right? It might take a lot more dollars to satisfy a vain upper-crust socialite from New York than a hippie surfer on the beaches of California. An extra dollar doesn't always bring more satisfaction to the person who has fewer dollars already. Many people seek out lower paying but less demanding jobs with less responsibility and less stress because their consumption preferences maybe are easy to satisfy. What's the point of having a demanding job if you don't really value the income that much? So again, you could challenge diminishing marginal utility by noting that even if it's true on average, it won't be true for everyone. And so the calculus becomes a lot more complicated. Some people have also noted that the process of equalizing is not costless. So even if it were possible to magically transfer income from A to B, that's one thing. But the real world has no magic. Redistributing money from A to B can make A angry, right? Which, of course, makes them unhappy, but also makes them lash out in various ways, lobby politically in various ways. There's a social cost to making A angry. 2, redistributing money from A to B costs real resources to both A and B in terms of taxes, bureaucracy, administration, and also resources spent on political lobbying by A, who wants the money, and B, who maybe wants to keep their money. So, and of course, all these resources spent on lobbying, on bureaucracy, on the IRS, on the Social Security Administration, on Medicare, all these resources could have been translated into overall social happiness more easily, perhaps, than in some other way. In other words, it's not costless to transfer money from A to B because you've got the cost of bureaucracy and the cost of politics. 3, redistributing money from A to B can cause both A and B to work less hard, counterintuitively, which produces less and thus diminishes both A and B satisfaction. So there might be a point at which one redistributes money from A to B but doesn't increase net societal satisfaction because A and B start responding to the scheme of redistribution by working less hard, producing less stuff, being less rich, and ultimately being less happy. Schmitz has a final problem, which amounts to a kind of collective action problem. even if we accept that, let's just say that it's costless to redistribute money, or the costs are negligible compared to the benefits, right? And we accept that more or less everyone gets the same satisfaction from each extra dollar. There's still a problem here. He notes that as we shift resources from rich to poor, we also shift resources from investment to consumption. Well, why do we shift resources from investment and consumption when we do that? Well, simply because if you have more money, you tend to invest a greater fraction of your income, right? Whereas if you have less money, you tend to consume a greater fraction of your income. So what this means is that you're shifting money from people who are investing to people who are consuming. So again, what's the problem with that? Well, the thing about investment is it's what enables us to grow the economy. It grows the effective amount of pie that we can redistribute, if you will. Investment is what enables economic growth by investing in new ventures, by expanding production, and so on and so forth. By engaging in radical egalitarianism, we might increase the total utility of society at one time, right? Everybody's happier at time T1, but we might cause that amount to decrease compared to what it would have been later at T2 in a world where a rich person had managed to invest their money and as such grow the economy, create more jobs perhaps, create new products and new methods of satisfying needs, or perhaps creating better ways to satisfy existing needs. So by understanding that the pie is not fixed over time, and that what it takes to grow that pie for everyone is some investment, utilitarianism starts diverging from egalitarianism. The perfect marriage may be an illusion created by a static perception of society, right? A static perception of society is if we only look at what would happen right now if we did the proposed action. A dynamic or diachronic perspective, these are different ways of saying looking at things over time, makes things more complicated because resources consumed are by definition not saved and invested. In other words, we have to we might think that urgency is not the same thing as being important, right? We worry that perhaps helping people consume more now prevents their children and grandchildren from enjoying a higher standard of living later, right? Meeting needs now makes it hard to meet needs later, certainly if we understand the economy as potentially one that grows over time. So diminishing marginal utility could be true. That is, it could be true that a dollar is worth more to a poor person to a rich person, and still not always support the case for radical egalitarianism. At some point, taking away a dollar from a rich person prevents investment that would grow the economy for later. In other words, to create fewer poor people later. According to Schmitz, we want to be careful not to consume all of our existing resources. Does that mean that Schmitz thinks that we should let people starve so the rich can invest and so the future people don't have to starve? I don't think that's right, right? I think what Schmitz is saying, yeah, of course we have to make sure to meet people's needs. After all, need is one of his fundamental principles of distributive justice. But if we do too much of it, right, we actually risk diminishing the well-being of society, understood as a multi-generational project, understood as including future people, not just current people, or even current people at future times. We don't want it to be the case that what we do now makes it certain that there'll be more needy people in the future than are necessary. Right? Now remember, diminishing marginal utility is a question about what happens at the margin. Where is the next dollar best spent for society? And we have to consider not just present costs, but also future costs, right? When people are starving, every extra dollar probably needs to be spent on stopping people from starving, right? That makes sense. But as their situation improves to the point where people can live simply but still have less than others, then at some point society is probably better off investing the extra dollars in a factory than in consumption for the poor. A factory here, of course, is a metaphor for anything that is a piece of capital that generates income later, right? It could be a factory, it could be education, it could be anything that's capital, right? Anything that generates larger amounts of income later. So a lot of debates between smart people, not the debates that you see every day and even among your friends. We're talking about debates between highly educated people, left and right. is trying to figure out at what point society needs to help meet needs versus at what point society needs to invest so as to meet future needs, right? Creating greater productive capacities so that future needs will be less, right? Small. If you're an accountant or if you've done any business classes or even economics classes, the idea of compound growth becomes important, right? The idea that small differences in the percentage of growth in the economy over the very long term, over a period of 20, 30, 40 years, makes huge differences in standards of living, right? Just small differences in economic growth make huge differences over the long term because growth compounds. So, can we think of contemporary debates that can be understood as debates between people trying to meet needs now and people who want to improve the economy's capacity to meet needs later? Note that there's no debate here about utilitarianism. There's no debate that what we should be doing, the important project, is to increase the aggregate satisfaction of society. But there is a question of time horizons, right? There's a question of a trade-off between needs now and needs later, right? Something that economists sometimes call the discount rate. Right? To what degree do we discount the well-being of future people? Future people may not be worth the same as present people. Present needs are often more urgent than future needs, which we don't know whether they will arise or not. But we can be relatively certain that if we don't grow the economy, future people will be at least as needy as present people. In fact, they'll probably be more needy than present people. All right. Thanks again for listening. And as always, if you have questions, feel free to get in touch.